Now, there's an interesting story to be told about the earnings of all the Star Wars movies that has never really been talked about, and I find it to be fascinating. So for the first time, exclusively, I believe you're going to be hearing this story here on the Han Talks First channel. And what I'm getting at is the release in which the movies came out were consistent with per each trilogy's earnings. Now, what I mean by that is every time a trilogy started, for example, with the originals, with A New Hope, it was a huge success and made tons of money. The next film, while equally as popular, made less, and then the third film made the least amount. And that was consistent with every trilogy that came out after the original. So, for example, let's go back to 1977, when A New Hope, or then known as just Star Wars, came out. It was a huge success, and it made millions of dollars at the box office. However, at the time, considering the time, it was a lot less than what we think of now. So for this circumstance, I have converted everything to inflation so it equals the amount of money it would be today in 2021. So A New Hope, for example, made $3.3 billion. That's how much it is with inflation. And that's a huge amount of money at the time. Like we just talked about, the highest grossing movie ever. It coined the term blockbuster, and it changed the way movies were going to be made thereafter. And of course, the hype leading up to its sequel, which at that time, everyone thought it was just going to be a one-and-done movie. However, the popularity increased, and George Lucas had the financial freedom to go on and make, sequels, which he built up in his empire of toys, licensing, and merchandising, which we'll talk about later. But eventually he went around to finally making Empire Strikes Back. And the movie was just a success, just as. Now, it didn't make as much money as the first one did. I mean, $3 billion is a huge feat, and that's a very high par standard. When Empire came out, it made almost 3 times less than that, which when we're talking about billions, that's still pretty good. Now, Empire made $1.7 billion. Again, this is with inflation in account. That's still a huge amount of money at the time, still one of the highest grossing films of all time. And it wasn't until the late 80s, early 90s that Empire, A New Hope, and even E.T., which we just talked about, actually fell down. And I think it was something like Alien or Jurassic Park that made it to the top. But it took a very long time for, the head honcho of biggest box office to be knocked down from its ranks. Continuing on, in 1983, when Return of the Jedi came out, it was still a huge amount of money, but still less than The Empire Strikes Back, with $1.2 billion. So it only dropped about 500 million, excuse me. But the point I'm getting at here is each film, as they came out, became less successful in a monetary sense. All very popular and financially gaining in some way, but they did make less money as they came out. Now, as the time went by, 15 years, and everyone thought the franchise was going to be over, they would never make any more, George Lucas announced he was going to make a sequel trilogy. And of course, The Phantom Menace was announced. The Phantom Menace came by, and it was the biggest hyped movie of all time, right? I mean, Star Wars was back, and it made a ton of money. Tons of money. It was a huge box office smash. People had never seen anything like it with a sequel film, well, technically a sequel, but a prequel film, and a huge comeback for the franchise. But get this, it didn't even make as much as The Empire Strikes Back did. While at the time this was still a very successful number, Phantom Menace made only $1.6 billion. Now again, I say only, but that's still a momentous number, and it's amazing. But as we're talking about consistency, 3 years later, maybe it was 4. I think it was 3 or 4 years later, the Attack of the Clones movie was going to come out. And if we're following the consistent timeline, you would assume it would make more or less money, and it did. However, it still did make a huge amount of money, but it did end up making $950 million. So it didn't pass the $1 billion mark. At the time, this was still a huge number. And you got to remember also, these movies were not Hollywood films at this time. Up before Disney had bought these films, everything was owned by George Lucas. So these were technically independent productions. And to get numbers like this was unfathomable for an independent filmmaker. But George Lucas knew how to do it. Now, here's where it gets interesting and a little bit inconsistent with the numbers. Revenge of the Sith came out, and this was going to be the movie that everyone thought the prequels were going to be about, right? The turning of Anakin Skywalker into Darth Vader. This was the moment everyone was waiting for. This was when the Senate turned into the Empire, and, Palpatine took over as the Emperor, and of course, Darth Vader comes into fruition, and we figure out where Luke and Leia came from. So it's understandable that this movie would want to make more money, and it did. Worldwide, it made $950 million, which is a huge amount. And I'm sure you're probably you're saying to yourself, but Han, that's more money than Attack of the Clones made. Correct. Worldwide, it did do that. But if we're looking at the domestic numbers for the United States of America, it actually made $100 million less, which is consistent with this narrative that we're telling here about the monetary levels going down per film that comes out. Now, of course, we bypass another 12 years, and Disney buys Star Wars, and they start to announce that they're going to make new Star Wars movies and a new trilogy. The Force Awakens was announced. The hype was just as huge as it was for The Phantom Menace. And people thought this movie was going to, again, change the way movies were made. And regardless of your opinions on the sequel trilogies, they are all successful. Every Star Wars movie that has come out has been a success. Maybe the exemption is Solo, but we're not going to talk about that one today. Nor are we going to talk about Rogue One. But anyway, when The Force Awakens came out, it hit a world record as the highest grossing movie for America at the time. So domestically in the US, it still is the highest grossing film of all time. The worldwide numbers, however, it didn't quite meet that mark. When it came out in 2015, The Force Awakens made $2.2 billion. Now again, if you're thinking that's wrong, I adjusted all these numbers accounting inflation, so these are equivalent to 2021, US dollar worth. So it made $2.2 billion. That was huge. It was a big deal. Disney needed to make their money back after purchasing Lucasfilm and, spending almost $5 billion for this franchise, which we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But it proved a point that Star Wars was back, Star Wars was alive, and it actually made more money than The Phantom Menace did. Still, however, did not make more money than A New Hope. A New Hope, to this day, is one of the highest grossing films of all time. Now, if you adjust inflation, the highest grossing film of all time is actually Gone with the Wind or Sound of Music. I think it might be Gone with the Wind. But anyway, it was so long ago, people often forget about it. But anyway, 3 years later, we come to the point where The Last Jedi was going to come out, the sequel for The Force Awakens. Now, the ending of Episode 7, of course, we all know, ended on one of the biggest cliffhangers in all of cinematic history. Literally, Luke Skywalker standing on the edge of a cliff, all just to throw that lightsaber over his shoulder. Anyway, considering the fact that it was ended on such a big cliffhanger, and it had one of the most important characters in Star Wars, Luke Skywalker, that everyone got to miss out on in Episode 7, they finally got to see him in Episode 8. So you would expect that The Last Jedi would gross more money than The Force Awakens did. It had to, right? I mean, everyone who saw The Force Awakens several times was going to go see The Last Jedi because we're all waiting to see Luke. Remember that opening crawl in The Force Awakens? It starts off with Luke Skywalker has vanished. That's one of the best openings to any movie as far as a preface goes. Loved it. Anyway, get to Last Jedi. In 2017, it grossed $1.4 billion. That's almost $1 billion less than The Force Awakens made. Now again, these numbers are adjusted for inflation. The Last Jedi should have made more than The Force Awakens, considering the time we live in now and everyone knew that a sequel was coming and that huge cliffhanger all in consideration. I think the reason why this one didn't make as much money is because people were burnt out. They didn't like, about half the audiences probably didn't like The Last Jedi. Now, while everyone who saw The Force Awakens most likely did go see The Last Jedi, the reason that made The Force Awakens so successful was people kept going back to rewatch the movie. That's another reason why The Phantom Menace was so successful. People went to go see that movie 5, 10, 15 times in the theaters. And of course, the same thing for A New Hope. Each first installment of each trilogy was a movie that had changed the way movies were made at the time. You could argue The Force Awakens isn't, but it was a period of time, duration between each trilogy that people hadn't seen Star Wars. And the first installment is the one that people see over and over and over because you're really not sure if there's going to be another after that. However, Last Jedi came out and it made significantly less. Still a successful film, but it made a lot less. 3 years later, here comes The Rise of Skywalker, making it one of the biggest disappointments in all of Star Wars, actually. Now, this movie, out of the Skywalker saga, made second to last the least amount of money for Star Wars. And it ranked in at gross of $1.0 billion. The one right below that is Attack of the Clones with $950 million. But The Rise of Skywalker, the finale of the Skywalker saga, the end of a trilogy, the end of a franchise. This was supposed to be the biggest movie of all time. Yes, every other third installment of the trilogies before was, at the time, the end of a franchise. But this was it. This was the last one. We're never going to see Luke Skywalker, Carrie, Princess Leia, Han Solo together like we did in this at this point in time. One, because either the characters were killed, or people passed away in real life, or people have just moved on and they're not interested anymore. But this Rise of Skywalker should have been the highest grossing of this trilogy, or at least of another trilogy, and it should have at least made more than The Last Jedi. But again, people's interests fell. They weren't satisfied with the content, or they didn't go see it multiple times. I think the reason why it did become over $1 billion film is because everyone just wanted to see the ending. They wanted to see how they did it. Even if they didn't care, they just wanted to know what happened. And honestly, I don't think it would have made $1 billion if it was not for the return of Emperor Palpatine. If that trailer hadn't have kicked off with that sinister laugh, this movie would probably not have made $1 billion. I mean, look at the numbers. It barely made it. $1.099.038 billion. That's ridiculous. This movie should have easily been at least 1.5 billion. But that's the interesting case of the trilogy films. They start off really strong, and they continually get worse. Now, my point of bringing all this up is not because it's interesting to look at, but because if we think about it from an audience standpoint, the general audiences appreciate movies more when there's a stretch of time in between them. So I, for one, am happy that Lucasfilm Disney has taken a hiatus from Star Wars movies. They canceled the anthology trilogies or postponed them and extended them. They're focusing more on television, and they're waiting for the right moment to develop a good movie for theaters. And I think that's going to make it so that when the next one does come out, it's going to make big numbers for them. It's going to be a huge hype train for us, and we're all going to be really excited about it. But it's just something interesting to think about. And going forward, in the next trilogy, in the next set of movies, can we see the same pattern? The first film does really well, and then the next two thereafter, or three after, do a little less. I see a pattern with Star Wars movies, and we could see that going forward.